is relatively short, measures of leverage. We'll talk about operating leverage, financial leverage, total leverage, and a couple measures of break even, and that's all we've got to cover here, so let's jump on in. Leverage refers to the effect of fixed elements in the cost structure. Well, we've got two types of fixed elements in the cost structure. We've got fixed operating expenses as opposed to variable operating expenses. Remember, variable costs are the ones that change with your output, and fixed expenses such as your operating plant, your equipment, things like that, don't change with output. So those are our fixed operating costs. And to the extent the firm takes on debt, then they have fixed financing costs. They have interest costs that they must pay each period. Now, business risk can come from a variety of sources. Certainly from variation in demand, and so as demand fluctuates, we have fluctuations in sales, which will affect operating income and net income. The idea of operating leverage is to the extent that you have fixed operating costs in your cost structure, then this is going to magnify the effect of change in sales on operating earnings, or EBIT. Then overlaid on that is financial risk. When we have debt, we have interest payments, right? We're starting with earnings before interest and taxes, and then we're going down into the interest part. So to the extent we have debt financing, this variation in operating earnings will be magnified again, and we'll get even more variation in earnings per share. Well, this is one of the ideas of why we look at financial leverage so carefully with a company, because as they increase their level of debt financing, their financial leverage, then we find that earnings per share gets more variable, so it's more risky, more uncertain. We need to use a higher discount rate in order to calculate the value of that equity security. So let's look at how we measure these things. Degree of operating leverage. First, understand very well what it means. It is our estimate of the ratio of the percentage change in operating earnings to the percentage change in sales. To calculate it, we put sales minus total variable costs in both the numerator and the denominator. And then we subtract fixed costs in the denominator. Now, one way for you to remember, gee, did I remember that formula right, is think of two things with this formula. One, if fixed costs were zero, highly unlikely, but if fixed costs were zero, then there's no operating leverage, and our ratio is 1. A 1% change in sales leads to a 1% change in operating income. As fixed costs increase, the denominator decreases, and our operating leverage goes up above 1. So let's take a look at a calculation here. We've got a firm that produced 5,000 units last year. I guess I should mention at this point that this degree of operating leverage is sensitive to where we are in terms of production and sales. At each different level of sales, we'll have a different degree of operating leverage. So it's calculated for a specific level of sales. This firm's fixed cost is $70,000, its selling price $75, and its variable unit cost $50. What was the firm's degree of operating leverage at 5,000 units? Well, we show two ways to calculate this. We can take sales minus total variable costs, as we showed last time in the formula on the last slide, or we can take quantity times price, so there's sales right there, minus quantity times variable cost per unit. That's total variable costs. So however we represent it, we subtract fixed costs in the denominator, and we do the calculation and find out that we have operating leverage of 2.27, meaning a 1% change in sales, up or down, leads to either a 2.27% increase or decrease in operating income. So there's our leverage effect of fixed operating costs. Now, measuring the degree of financial leverage, not too much different. The interpretation is now the percentage change in earnings per share, or that could be the percentage change in net income, divided by the percentage change in operating earnings. So there's our financial leverage. The calculation, we start with EBIT and then subtract interest from that. Again, If interest is zero, if there's no debt financing, then there's no financial leverage, and the degree of financial leverage equals 1. As interest expenses increase, financial leverage goes up, this ratio goes up above 1. Let's look at a calculation here. We've got a firm with operating earnings of $55,000 and interest expense of $20,000. If EBIT increases by 3%, what's the effect on earnings per share? Well, we've got two steps here. First, to calculate the degree of financial leverage, operating earnings minus fixed financing costs. So we get a degree of financial leverage here of 1.57. So if earnings per share increase by 3%, we multiply it times our degree of financial leverage, and our estimate of the change in earnings per share is 4.71%. Now, we do this for an increase here, same calculation for a decrease, except that would be minus 4.71. Just want to emphasize that leverage, whether it's operating leverage or financial leverage, cuts both ways. It magnifies the effects of both an increase and a decrease in sales. So the degree of total leverage is just the product of these two. You see here we can multiply them together and come up with the degree of total leverage. Well, the interpretation now is the percentage change in earnings per share divided by the percentage change in sales. So now we're talking about leverage all the way down the income statement, because we had percentage change in percentage change, I'll fit my little triangle in there, EBIT over percentage change in sales. That was our degree of operating leverage. And then we had percentage change in EP, earnings per share, over percentage change in EBIT, operating earnings. So when we multiply these together, these two cancel out, and we get the percentage change in earnings per share divided by the percentage change in sales. Let me clean up my beautiful writing there. So here's the calculation. Right here we've got operating income minus our fixed financing costs down there. Same numerator as we had for the degree of operating leverage, and we could also write it like this, which is the same thing. So let's look at that calculation now. We've got a firm, sales last year, $375,000, total variable costs of $250,000, fixed costs of $70,000, and interest expense of $20,000. Well, the calculation's not that hard. The numerator, sales minus total variable costs right there, and then sales minus total variable costs minus fixed operating costs minus fixed financing costs, and we get 3.57 as our degree of total leverage. Notice that the two values we calculated before, 2.27 for operating leverage and 1.57 for financial leverage, multiply them together, we can also get 3.57 that way, and the interpretation, a 1% change in sales will change net income or earnings per share by approximately 3.57%. So, a firm can have high operating leverage if they have high fixed costs, or shall we say a high proportion of fixed costs in their cost structure. A firm with a high debt ratio, high leverage, has a high financial leverage ratio. And if they have both, then they have high total leverage for sure. Let's look at a problem here. Polson Inc. has fixed operating costs of $1.5 million, fixed financing costs of $1 million, sells their output at $700 a unit, and has variable costs of $200 per unit. At an output of 5,000 units, a decrease in sales of 1% can be expected to decrease operating earnings by, so if we're talking about operating earnings and sales, we're talking about the degree of operating leverage. So we can do that calculation here. Our operating leverage, price, variable costs, number of units, same thing down here, fixed operating costs, 1.5 million, we get a degree of operating leverage of 2.5. So our expected change in operating earnings for a decrease in sales of 1% is a decrease of 2.5%. Skip too fast. Now we need to talk about our break-even quantity of sales. Pretty straightforward concept. When you make zero, you're breaking even. How do we calculate this quantity though? Well, we've got our total fixed costs, and the way to think about this is think, well, how many units do we have to sell to cover those fixed costs? Well, if we take price minus variable cost per unit, sometimes we call that the contribution margin. So each unit sold gives us this amount in the denominator to put toward our fixed costs. So if we divide the contribution to fixed costs of each unit by total fixed costs, we come up with a number of units to just cover our fixed costs and our variable costs. And that's our break-even quantity. So if price is 85, variable costs per unit are 60, and we have to cover fixed costs of $500,000, our break-even quantity is simply that $500,000 divided by this contribution margin, the excess of price over variable costs per unit. So we find out that at 20,000 units, we're at break-even quantity of sales. And we're also supposed to be able to calculate net income at various sales levels. Well, this is pretty straightforward. It's like a little baby income statement here. Let's check this example. Assume for the firm that the price is 85, variable costs are 60, fixed costs are 500,000, and interest is 20,000. Our quantity, 25,000 units, and let's just ignore taxes for the purposes of this calculation here. What's the firm's net income? Well, net income is simply price minus variable cost times quantity, then subtract out our fixed costs, subtract out our interest cost, and that's it. So in this case, here's our contribution margin. At 25,000 in sales, we subtract our fixed costs and subtract our fixed financing costs and come up with a net income of 105,000. So very straightforward learning outcome statement there. Now, when we talk about operating break-even, it's the level of sales that just covers a firm's fixed operating costs. So here's the fixed operating costs. Here's the variable cost per unit. And we go through this example here and find out our break-even is 12,000 units. Now, why was that different than what we calculated before for these same numbers? Well, that's because here, operating break-even just covers operating costs. We're not looking at our financing costs. If we go back to our earlier example, we had total fixed costs of 500,000. So that total fixed cost there is our fixed financing costs and our fixed operating costs. So if we go forward again, here we only had our fixed operating costs. So we had 200,000 in fixed financing costs. So operating break-even is going to be lower than break-even quantity when we have positive financing costs.